All right, we were looking at Ruth and the interpretive issues. We talked about the historicity of the book, following regular Hebrew narrative historical style. As far as its grammatical structure is concerned, very definitely the book begins with the fact that, and it came to pass with the verb consecutive, and the days when the judges judged. So that anchors it within history. And then we looked at the night at the threshing floor and saw that even though it was a daring move on the part of Naomi to send Ruth, yet she wanted to force Boaz to make his intentions known. And Ruth goes even further and asks Boaz to play the part of the kinsman redeemer. And that then is tied into the third interpretive issue, which, how are we understand the marriage of Boaz and Ruth? For as you go through the book, Boaz is identified as a Goel, a redeemer, because he is one of the relatives. 2:20. This man is our relative. He is near to us. He has a close family relationship, which means that he is able to redeem. And even though Naomi, where she speaks to Ruth in chapter 3, is not bringing that into play. She's just trying to get Boaz to marry Ruth. And yet, as Ruth speaks to Boaz, she brings up in verse 9, "Spread your covering over your maid, for you are a Goel, you are a redeemer." And though verse 12, "It is true I am a Goel, I am able to redeem," there is a Goel closer than I. As I was saying before, it shows that Boaz has already thought through the possibility of acting as the Goel. And recognizes, well, the reason I haven't made a move is because there is someone else who is a closer relative. Now, this whole concept of Goel, of redeemer, goes back to Leviticus and the fact of how a land can be sold. Leviticus chapter 25. So in Leviticus chapter 25, beginning in verse 23, "The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. You are but aliens and sojourners with me." And so he's speaking here about what's going to take place in the year of Jubilee. Every 50th year, the land reverts back to the original inheritor that then is listed for us when we get into the book of Joshua, chapters 13 to 19, as the land is distributed among the tribes. All right, that land is always to revert back to the one to whom it is given. Verse 24, "Thus for every piece of your property you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a brother of yours becomes so poor he has to sell his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his brother has sold. Or in case a man has no kinsman, but so recovers his means as to find sufficient for his redemption, then he shall calculate the year since the sale and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and so return to his property. But if he has not found sufficient means, and that which is sold remains in the hand of a person until the year of Jubilee, but at the Jubilee it shall revert, that he may return to his property." And so this land all right, is to be redeemed by an individual closer. Now, when you get a little further down in Leviticus chapter 25, beginning in verses 47, we have basically the pecking order here. So if a brother of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger, now this is not dealing with the land, but now he has sold himself into slavery, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him. Now obviously there is no brother involved in this situation, unless it's a brother of Elimelech, that is uncle to Mahlon. An uncle or an uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him if he prospers, etc. So we would imagine that the same determination as far as the redemption of the person would be the same pecking order as the redemption of the property. Now at this point, neither Ruth or Naomi have sold themselves into slavery. What we see in chapter 4, what is his issue, is the land. So that when Boaz convenes the town council and Mr. So-and-so, who was the closer relative, we see in verse 3, Naomi has to sell a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. Now, as he's saying at this point, Elimelech is literally our brother. So in other words, you're dealing with uncles as far as Mahlon is concerned. And then you would have the older brother down through the younger brother. Or as brother just here, a term of relationship like we have in Leviticus chapter 25. Because the way the word, if a brother of yours falls into, into poverty so that he sells land or sells himself into slavery, obviously it's not specifically the brother of that individual that has to redeem him, as we saw in Leviticus chapter 25. So it could be using brother as a relative of ours, our relative Elimelech. And Naomi is poor, and for her well-being, she has to sell the land. And then, of course, he brings in the clincher in verse 5, on the day you buy the field. Because the nearer relative, all right, I'll buy the field. I got the wherewithal to buy the field. Well, on the day you buy the field, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. I realize that's not Mahlon, that is Elimelech, all right? He is the one. Naomi is the wife. It is the property of Elimelech that Naomi is selling. Oh, and by the way, of course, what's the use of having the land? Elimelech has got to have seed too to have that land. And that's where the man turns and says, I can't do it. That would mar my own inheritance. In some way, the text doesn't tell us. So the question comes, all right, why the marriage? And the standard answer has been that, well, this is a Levirate marriage. This is a Levirate marriage. In other words, Boaz is playing the role of the Levirate, of the brother, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25. I like the way Dan Block, puts it, that even though there's some differences between what's in Deuteronomy chapter 25 and what's in Ruth chapter 4, what else can it be? That if a marriage is taking place to raise up seed to the deceased, isn't that the Levirate marriage? But But there are some problems. You go back to Deuteronomy chapter 25, and this is where we'll pick it up, where the brother will not do the part of the raising up seed. So verse 7, but if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come up to him in the sight of the elders, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and declare, thus it shall be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And in Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. Whoa. So you don't want to do that. What a shameful thing to have a woman come up to you, yank your sandal off, and spit in your face. I mean, what could be more humiliating for a man in Israel than having a woman do that? I mean, it's humiliating for a man to come up and spit in your face. But a woman to confront you in that way and do that, and then to have the name from then on, the man whose sandal has been removed. I don't think you have to walk around without a sandal, but, you know, just, hey, see him? The guy without the sandal right there. You know, son, if you don't do what the law says about raising up seed, look, you're going to have to walk around without a sandal too. Or at least be called the man without the sandal. Well, certainly there's a sandal involved in chapter 4 of Ruth. But the interesting thing is, it seems as though it was the man himself, that is, the nearer relative, who removed his sandal. And the author even has to explain in verse 7, this was a custom in former times concerning the redemption exchange to confirm a matter, that is, of the land. This is not dealing with marriage. A man removed his sandal. That is, what the author is saying is this previous custom, now you readers, you don't follow this custom anymore, but the custom back then was when a man renounced his redemption of property, that he would not redeem the property, he would take his sandal off as an indication that he was giving up that right and giving that right to another. The shoe custom was no longer known. Well, obviously they had known what was in Deuteronomy chapter 25. But the author takes time to explain, which seems to indicate that the sandal ceremony that is in Ruth is not the same one that is in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Now, with Deuteronomy chapter 25, we have some other problems. Boaz was not Mahlon's brother. That in Deuteronomy chapter 25, it's very clear that if a firstborn dies, then it's incumbent upon the next son to play the role of the partner to raise up seed by the previous brother's wife. The first son being considered the older brother's son, and then the next son would be considered his son. But Boaz was not Mahlon's brother. Again, there's an unresolved question on whether he was Elimelech's brother, but not Mahlon's. Ruth did not go to the city gate. Deuteronomy 25 is very clear in a Levirate situation. It is the wife who is to go before the elders and call for marriage. And Ruth did not pull off the shoe or spit in the face. So as you read Deuteronomy chapter 25, there's really, in the end, what you're dealing with in Ruth chapter 4 is a different situation. But at the end of the day, how did the marriage tie into the buying of the land? In other words, what is behind Ruth chapter 4 is Leviticus chapter 25, not Deuteronomy chapter 25. But we already know from chapter 1 that Naomi is beyond the point of having children. Even if, and it won't happen, I had a son this very evening. If I could get married and have a son, would you wait? No, no. It is harder for me than for you. Go back. You have no hope coming with me. So Naomi is past the point of having a child through her own womb. Therefore, the only way that seed can be raised within the family of Elimelech is through whom? The wife of the deceased son of Elimelech Mahlon. And that's where Ruth comes in to the picture. And Ruth just happens to have converted to being a Yahweh worshiper, is a woman of Hesed, a loyal woman. She is a woman of virtue. And let's face it, she is a woman that Boaz has fallen in love with. In the right way, that is. And as he admires her and realizes the godly qualities in her life that will make her a suitable partner. It also seems to be assumed that Boaz is an older man, possibly the same age as Naomi, and because he commends Ruth for not going after younger men, 3:10, whether poor or rich, but she is willing to act for the benefit of Naomi. Ruth, I knew what kind of woman you were. And yeah, I'll play the role, but there's an error guy. But you know, now you've asked me to marry you. Now you've thrown yourself into the equation. Now I've got the trump card to go and convene the elders and talk to Mr. So-and-so. And by the way, that's the author's title. He had a name, but the name is not given. Because obviously the author doesn't want to shame the nearer relative who refused to buy the property and to marry Ruth. So I lean toward position B, knowing it is very, very difficult. I would put it this way, that this is about the redemption of the land. And for the redemption of the land to have any impact and effect, there has to be a son born to Naomi. That because of what is in Leviticus chapter 25, that is Elimelech's land. And though the son who comes forth can have the dual role of also inheriting Elimelech's land, but also being in the line of Boaz, is seen at the end of the book, that is true. But in the redemption of the property, he becomes the inheritor of the land that was given to Elimelech. But the only way possible within this situation was by marriage to Ruth. And since the nearer relative, for whatever reason, was unwilling to marry Ruth, Boaz gets to play the role of the Redeemer. Oh, and by the way, along with the land, he also got to marry Ruth. And does so. And, makes it very, very clear. In verse 10 of chapter 4, I've acquired Ruth the Moabitess to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. So he is a man of means. He is a man of wealth. who is able to use that wealth to purchase Naomi's property. And this is where my wife doesn't like it. I'll get Ruth as a throw-in to the whole transaction. There you go. You ruined the story. You know. Wasn't it, and they lived happily ever after? Yeah, because he bought the land. All right? And the business was transacted, and through Ruth, seed is raised up to the dead man's name to inherit the property. So that's how the marriage, is tied in. And I would say it is a non-Levirate marriage, although the broad aspects of redemption and raising up seed to the deceased are part and parcel of what is taking place within this situation. And then fourth of all, how do we correlate this to Deuteronomy chapter 23? Deuteronomy chapter 23, which is very, very clear that because of the response of the Ammonites and the Moabites to Israel as they were coming through the wilderness to enter the land of Canaanite, that and particularly with the Moabites hiring Balaam, that what is said in verse 3 is, no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of theirs, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of Yahweh, because they did not meet with food and water. They hired Balaam. And so verse 6, you shall not seek their peace or their prosperity all your days. Now notice there's no prohibition there of not marrying them. It's just the fact they cannot enter into the assembly of Israel. So how do we answer it? Well, some say, well, Ruth was in the 11th generation. You shan't have any Ammonite or Moabite to the 10th generation. Now that's from 1400 BC or 1407, when they didn't meet Israel on the way. So now we're toward the end of the Judges period. 10 generations have passed, and Ruth is in the 11th generation, so she could enter the Yahweh's assembly. Well, most take it that the 10th generation, in fact, it is understood figuratively, even to the 10th generation shall not enter the assembly, shall ever enter the assembly. And verse 6, you shall never seek their peace. The 10th seems to be you don't count off and say, oh, 11th generation, it's over. Now you guys can come in if you wish. Seems to be the 10th generation means, figuratively, that is long into the future. In fact, forever. Never seek their peace or prosperity. Ruth was considered a worshiper of Yahweh. Yes, she was. But balance that out. Even after she confesses her faith in Yahweh, she's turned around, she has turned away from Chemosh, the god of Moab, to embrace Yahweh. Still, throughout the book, even to the end, she is still being referred to as Ruth the what? Moabitess. Hubbard says, well, it was an exception because of her devotion to Yahweh and worthy character. Yes, but in the end, she's still Ruth the Moabitess. I think in the end, all we can say is she received Yahweh's grace. She was a Moabitess that Yahweh allows to enter. And someone said, well, we never see her worshiping within the book. Well, I think it's assumed. It's true. It never says she went up to the temple and joined Israel in worship. But certainly she is a Moabitess who is accepted by the people of Bethlehem as a part of their community. And I would say that at the end of the day, the only answer is she receives Yahweh's grace. That, yes, she is a Moabitess. And yes, because of that, she is and was uniquely under Yahweh's curse, but Yahweh released the curse and its effect in the case of Ruth. Same way as Rahab. Every Canaanite was to be put to death. But Rahab had faith in Yahweh. And Yahweh showed by the very fact that that part of the wall was the only part of the wall left standing, that it was his will that Rahab not be under that curse, but by her faith could be accepted into the assembly of Israel. How did she get there? By God's grace. How did Ruth get there? By God's grace. How do you and I get there? By God's grace. So I think in the end, it's just a picture of Yahweh's grace. A picture of the fact that those who are under a curse, even under an everlasting curse, can receive grace from Yahweh based upon faith in him to become part of his people. Now all of this enters into the preaching of Ruth. Now, my friends, don't make Ruth an allegory of salvation. So that in the end, Ruth and Boaz and Naomi really don't, stand for anything more than, Naomi is embittered Israel, embittered yet faithful Israel. Ruth is the Gentile who is willing to proselytize and embrace Yahweh. And of course, Boaz is the messianic figure, because in the end, he marries the Gentile bride and brings blessing to his people, Israel. Yeah, preach it. I'm trying to say, don't preach it this way. All right. Now, as an illustration of the poor who has sold the property and needs help from an outside source, as a picture of what has taken place of those under sin and why they need a Messiah, fine. But in the end, it really is a story of three faithful individuals seeking, as faithful followers of Yahweh, to display hesed to the other, to seek the best for the other person, that in the end, God, who is in control of all of the events that take place in the book, is the one that blesses them beyond what they are able to ask or even think. Their prayers come to pass, because God is a God who does, in his grace, reward those who follow him. And in light of that, is there a Christological thrust to the book? Well, ultimately, yes, because it's out of that kind of a faithful household that ultimately comes David, and the greater David, Jesus Christ. And it's this, David's background is a picture ultimately that God will raise up another righteous couple by the name of Mary and Joseph, and by his grace will allow them also to be involved in the bringing of the greater David into the world. But you need the rest of the canon of Scripture to understand that. So Ruth as Ruth. And I would preach Ruth as Ruth. I forget how many messages I did. That's my wife. That's why my wife knows how I preach Ruth, because she heard it. I think I had about 7 messages on Ruth, talking about unwise decisions, chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, talking about the consequences of unwise decisions, verses 6 to 22, and how the godly lose hope when the consequences of their bad decisions, come within their lives. But chapter 2, how God does have a remedy, and in what on the human side seems to be a mere chance meeting of Ruth and Boaz will become the means in chapter 3 that first Naomi and then Ruth and Boaz will show their loyalty to each other. And in chapter 4, how Mr. Businessman Boaz will deal with the situation according to Torah, and in the end be blessed and with a wife. And in verses 13 to 17, a message how everything is reversed from Naomi's situation in chapter 1 in the end in chapter 4. And then, do a message on the genealogy. You can do it. You can preach the genealogy. And, talk about how God is the one who through the genealogy is seen to have the guiding hand in what has led up to Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, and what will lead on into David. So, the God who knows your name, and the God who is involved in all of the births that take place within the line that will lead up to David. So preach it, or turn around and just do it as one message. Now just take the big idea and just develop it and preach it in one message. It is a book. It is a book that you should preach, because 2/3 of your congregation will be women. And what I mean by that is that for some reason, ladies really respond to Ruth. That is the book of Ruth. Because it deals with men. I mean, this is better than any Christian novel that's out there today in the Christian bookstore. And I mean, ladies are buying those and reading them, so give them a wonderfly edifying canonical story, and preach Ruth. I didn't get so many compliments from ladies in my congregation of my preaching as when I preached Ruth, and I'm convinced my preaching wasn't any better, but they like the story, and prayerfully it would relate to them on a spiritual level as well. Now we really deal with Esther in the middle of the story, but we take them in strict canonical sequence here, following the Jewish canon. And remember those 5 inner books of the writings after Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, and before Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. Those 5 books begin with Ruth, and the Masoretic tradition end with Esther. So in this course, since the other middle 3 books we deal with in 502, we go from Ruth to Esther. And of course it also works out that we go from a book about a woman to a book about a woman. All right, and we come to the book of Esther, and that is the title that is given to the book. However, and again, I'll get myself in trouble, that really, in the end, it is not so much a book about Esther as it is a book about Mordecai. Sorry about that. Now, Esther plays a very, very important role. No doubt about it. Mordecai's only way he can influence a change on what is taking place, and now we're into the Persian Empire. We're now into that post-exilic period, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The only way he can deal with that is through his niece Esther. But at the end, it is very interesting. In chapter 10, when the author finally gets around to summing up the results of what he has narrated within the book, it's all about Mordecai. 10:2, and all the accomplishments of his authority, that is Ahasuerus, and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus and great among the Jews, and in favor with the multitude of his kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. And my response is to the God-directed author, well, what about Esther? I mean, in the end, who's the hero? Who's the one who seeks the good of his people and spoke for the welfare of his whole nation? I mean, who was the instrument of deliverance for the nation in the story? That's Esther. But at the end of the book, it is all about the greatness of Mordecai. And of course, that's what we see within the book, because who gets Esther her position as queen? Who gets Esther to use that position as queen for the well-being of her people within the book? It is Mordecai. Uncle Mork is he's the one, and so it is Esther. That's the way it is referred to in both the Hebrew Septuagint, and comes down in the English tradition. But for the author, he puts a special emphasis upon Mordecai. Now, when do the events of the book take place? Now, we'll talk about the historicity later. We believe it is historical. But when do the events take place? And you need to take a look at the chart in Walton on page 70 that I have listed for you there. And if there was to be a written consequence of today's class on Friday, I will point out that there are 5 important Persian kings that are to be committed to memory for understanding of the post-exilic books, of which Ruth is the first one that we are looking at. For in 539 BC, Cyrus, the king of the Persians, captured the city of Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire came under his control, and the Persian Empire in its fullness was established thanks to that victory. And from 539 BC until the coming of Alexander, with the collapse of the Persian Empire in 331, 330 BC, that this is the period when the Persians dominated the ancient Near East, all the way from the borders of the Indus River Valley all the way through to Asia Minor, and even across North Africa into the territory of Egypt for a time. That whole territory was Persian. It begins with Cyrus, who dies in 530 BC, followed by Cambrys for 8 years, and then Darius the First. Now, even though Cyrus is, Cyrus is listed here, he is, it's during his reign that the Jews return to Jerusalem and start to rebuild the foundations of the temple. The ark, as we'll see, the altar, I mean, as we see when we get to the book of Ezra. I got to be careful there. It's not the ark. You know, Steven Spielberg would not have had a movie if we had knew where the ark was. It's the altar that is restored in Jerusalem. No ark in the Holy of Holies. Now that is not returned. And what might have happened to the ark, we'll find out during the millennium. All right? And there's all kinds of traditions of what have happened. But where was I before I was saying? Cambrys. Okay, Cyrus is when they're able to go back. The altar and the sacrifices are reestablished during Cambrys' time. Is a time when the temple is not being constructed. We believe it comes to a stop before actually Cyrus dies. But during Cambrys' days, it is not renewed. But during the time of Darius the First, from 522 to 486, Haggai and Zechariah prophesy, and it's during his reign in 515 BC that the temple is completed and reconstituted within Israel's worship. Now, with the building of the temple in 515 BC, Ezra chapter 6, there is then in Ezra Nehemiah a gap. And we have a gap from 515 to 458 BC. And it is during that gap where we have the reign of Xerxes from about 486 to 464 BC, and it is during the time of Xerxes. Xerxes is the name used by Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote the history of the Persian Wars. That is, the battles between the Persians and Greece, and refers to the king as Xerxes. And of course, within the Old Testaments, the name that is given to him is the name Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is the Xerxes that we read about in Herodotus. He dies, and then we have Artaxerxes the First. There's some later Artaxerxes, second and third. But Artaxerxes the First, and with his reign, the Old Testament history comes to an end. He probably dies around 424. Walton puts 423. There's some debate upon these dates within 1 year from the death of Darius through the death of Artaxerxes. But what he has done for you on this chart is he's given you, these are the 5 Persian kings during the post-exilic period that is recorded within the Old Testaments. And he has recorded the significant events, biblical events that take place during their reign. And you can see during the time of Xerxes is when we have the story of Esther, when the historical events in Esther take place. And then beginning in 490, we have the battles that take place between the Persians and the Greeks. And so he's gone ahead and filled in some of that information. And then you can see the latter part of the chart is where he calls about the biblical silence. All right, the Old Testament canon has come to an end. The history is now completed. but obviously the events continue to take place after the ending of the Old Testament canon. And so he lines out for you there the rest of the Persian kings and what was happening in Greece until ultimately we have Alexander, who comes and establishes the Greek Empire. So this is a chart, and particularly the first part, be well aware of. It gives you the basic history you need to know for the post-exilic, the Persian period, the end of the Old Testament history. Now, certainly, and I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but as you go through the book of Esther, Esther does give you a number of times some very precise dating. So that we find out in 1:3, in the 3rd year of the reign of Ahasuerus, is when he gathers all of his governors and his generals together for this banquet. We also find out when we get to chapter 2, verse 16, that Esther becomes king in the 10th month of the 7th year of the reign of Ahasuerus. And in chapter 3, verse 7, in the 1st month, in the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, is when Haman hatches the plot where he seeks to put to death the Jews. And one of the best charts that I've ever seen for the chronology of Esther is given for you within the MacArthur Study Bible, taking these dates that are found within the book of Esther and showing how you can plot them out. Now, the top line here, as you can see, is the reign of Ahasuerus from 486 to 465, 464 BC. All right, and then the events within the book of Esther, beginning in his 3rd year, are laid out for us. Here's the events of the book of Esther, and they take place over an approximately 10-year period from 483 to 473. All right, so he's taken the whole of Ahasuerus' reign and then said, all right, and it's during these years of his reign that the events in the book of Esther take place. And beginning with Haman's plots. That is recorded for us at in chapter 3, through the working out of the second decree, and how instead of in the Adar, that the Jews are destroyed, the Jews are able to destroy their enemies, that basically from 3:7 all the way through 9:8, the book basically gives you a year worth of events, and then conclusion is brought to show how because of the events there is a continuing feast, Purim, within the Hebraic tradition. And then in chapter 10, Mordecai's continued influence during, we might put it here, the latter years of the reign of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. So there it is. There's the historical chronology of Esther, and helps you to fit in the chronological statements that are made within the book. Now, it is very, very interesting that when you get to Esther, in the Hebrew canon, you find that it is right after Ecclesiastes and right before Daniel. Right before the book that is going to reveal for us the course of Israel during the time of Gentile domination. upon the earth, and particularly over the holy city and upon Daniel's people, Israel. Interestingly, before you read Daniel, you read this historical events of God's people as they live under Gentile domination. And in fact, when we get to 502, we're going to find out that Daniel is, in those Sunday school stories from chapter 2 through 7, he's going to give us some insight into the character of Gentile rulers, so that Israel would not be, would understand that Gentile rulers that God is using in and of themselves tend to be proud, tend to be easily manipulated by those who will appeal to their hubris, to their pride. O king, you are the great one. There is no one like you on the face of the earth. And show your greatness by doing this. Oh, I really am that great, aren't I? Well, why don't you go ahead and, do it? And we see how we've got these proud, dumb Gentiles that are easily manipulated because of their vanity. And of course, when you're reading in Daniel, after you've read Esther, you should have no problem understanding, I have just read about the same kind of a Gentile ruler in Esther. Proud, pompous, vain, easily manipulated, and yet one whom God will use almost against his will to bring a deliverance for his people, that is the Jewish people, even though Ahasuerus had previously been manipulated by Haman to issue a decree for the destruction of the Jewish people. And so we see how Esther prepares us for the reading of Daniel, and how the reading of Daniel helps us to appreciate some of the theology that is taking place in the book of Esther. Because left to itself, you have some question marks about how Esther ever got into the canon. In fact, the Jews discussed the book of Esther and its canonicity more than any other book, for the first two reasons. Esther is one of the two books within the Old Testament that has no mention anywhere of God's name. And so during the intertestamental period, additions to Esther were written to fill in the story. And guess how they filled in the story? Well, by mentioning God's name quite a bit. And of course, by also talking about the temple and the law and prayer, and trying to make Esther and Mordecai come across as good, pious Jewish folk. Trying to say what's implicit within the original story, we'll make explicit. Implicit is the hand of God. Well, we'll make sure people with these additions can read it and see the hand of God. And implicit within it is Mordecai and Esther's concern for the well-being of the Jews. Well, we will expand that to make sure that explicitly what was implicitly within the story is not missed. So you can read the additions to Esther, and you can read everything that was left out according to the intertestamental Jews. But the thing is, it's not part of the original canonical book. The original canonical book is what we have in our Esther. And in our Esther, as originally directed by the Holy Spirit, there's no mention of God's name. And of course, that is there by literary design. We've already seen a little bit of that in Ruth, where God's name is mentioned quite extensively. but as opposed to what we have seen within the Torah and the former prophets, where God is not seen to do that much directly. Well, if there's just two things in Ruth, by the time we get to Esther, nothing is directly stated by the author to have been done by God. And yet he will write the story in such a way, with so many interesting coincidences and reversals, that the only explanation for what takes place within the book is the hand of God. But no mention of God's name, no mention of Palestine, the land, Jerusalem, the temple, the law, prayer. The closest we get to any kind of religious observance stated within the book other than Purim, the feast that was established, is in chapter 4, where Esther asks that the people would fast. 4:16, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me 3 days. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. But fasting is not prayer. Fasting is fasting. Fasting is not taking food. Now, the only fast that has been mentioned in Torah is the fast from sunup to sundown of the Day of Atonement, when the Israelites would, in that fast, remember their sinful condition, mourn their sinful condition, and recognize what God had done and was doing in the goats of the Day of Atonement to bring about a forgiveness and release from that sin. So there is certainly within the fast a recognition that this is a lamentable situation that is before the Jews. Now, as you go through the book, and there are so many of these, reversal of human plans. Reversal of human plans. For instance, in chapter 4, Esther is been placed within the palace. She is the queen of the king. And yet all of a sudden, Mordecai has to state to her that even though people don't know that you're a Jew, don't think that you will escape. So that and there's now a reversal of your position. 4:13, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. You've had a privileged position, and now it is in jeopardy. It's been reversed. You are now in danger. Chapter 6, a great reversal. Haman shows up. As you heard, says, hey, I got to honor someone. Simple. Take your cloak, put it on a man, parade him through the city for honor. Haman thinking, of course, who else would the king want to honor but me? Yeah, it's good. Go do that for Mordecai. Reversal. Chapter 7. The very gallows, verse 10, which had been prepared for Mordecai, was where they hanged Haman. That's a great reversal. The gallows Haman built to hang Mordecai are the same gallows upon which Haman was hung. In chapter 8, we have the reversal through the second decree. That now instead of the Jews being in the position to be destroyed, they are able to destroy their enemies. And chapter 9, verse 1 makes what is implicit within the book of all these reversals explicit. because the author even says that. He says that, as you can see, now in the 12th month, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed on that day, when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary. It was reversed. So the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. And really, for the book, that is the greatest reversal. That when the enemies hoped to gain mastery over the Jews gained the mastery over those who hated them. The very day established for the destruction of the Jews was a very day of Jewish deliverance. And so you have this, and these are just a number that could be pointed out of the reversals of human plans that are seen within the book. Now, certainly as you go through the book, there is this tremendous emphasis upon the Jewish people, the Jews. This is the term by which they were known by the Gentiles. And the author uses that. The term Jew comes from the term Judah. It was Judah that had been taken predominantly into Babylonian captivity. And as the Persians had taken over Babylon, they came upon these exiles who gained the name Jews. It's a name that the Gentiles would use for these people. And of course, we see as we go through the book that this is the issue. Will the Jews survive? Will the Jews survive with this very directed attack against their very existence as a people within the Persian Empire? And we do not believe historically that at the time when the events of the book of Esther takes place, that there were any Jewish people outside of the Persian Empire. Remember, they controlled everything from, to the very east of modern-day Iran, and at this point also had the northern part of Egypt and into Asia Minor. In other words, we don't know of any Jews who are outside of the domain of the Persian Empire at this point. So a decree that every Jew within the Persian Empire should be put to death would be the death knell of the Jewish people. And yet God will grant deliverance. Now, two things are emphasized within the book. That is this hatred of the Jews and yet fear of the Jews on the part of the Gentiles. I've listed some verses for you there. When Haman saw that Mordecai, chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. It's not just that he hates Mordecai, he hates the very people from whom Mordecai came. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. I don't like Mordecai, but more than that, I don't like the people from whom Mordecai came. And that's going to motivate him to hatch this plot of seeking to destroy the Jews. And yet, the Gentiles, seen within Haman's own wife, and later on those associated with him, who say, not a good thing to take on the Jews. 6:13, and Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and friends, everything that had happened to him, that is, everything he had to do for Mordecai. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. There was a hatred of the Jews, but there was also a recognition that you don't take the Jewish people on without suffering some very, very severe consequences. Now, why had that been so? Well, Haman is second in control to Ahasuerus, the king of Persia. He could go back, and so could his wise men and those associated with him, and remember what had taken place to those who opposed the Jewish people before the Persian king, as recounted in Ezra chapters 1 to 6. In the end, who won? All right, you got Jewish enemies, but in the end, it was the Jewish temple that had been built. And that's an indication, you take on the Jews and, all right, you're going to face some consequences. And again in chapter 8, verse 13, that after the edict had been issued, and the Jews should be ready to this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So there's enemies, those who hate the Jews. But there's also a fear of recognition that in the end, the Jews will win. And of course, that ties into the deliverance of the Jews. That's exactly what happens within the book. And Mordecai tells Esther in 4:14, if you remain silent, okay, Esther, if you don't want to use your position for the well-being of your people, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. Now, Mordecai doesn't know where that place is. And you and your father's house will perish. Mark my words, says Mordecai to Esther. And he doesn't use the word God, but relief and deliverance will arise from another place. The Jews will survive. Now, will it be through you or through some other means? Now, Mordecai does not stay at this point where his belief and faith for that comes, but he states very definitely this will not be allowed to take place. There will be a deliverance come to the Jewish people. And of course, what Mordecai says is seen in chapters 8 and 9. This is the way in this historical situation that God did bring his relief and deliverance of the Jews. Now, what about the major characters? You can't read this book without, and the author has drawn the characters where you can certainly pick up something of their character. King Ahasuerus. Interestingly, he is the one character from the beginning to the end of the book. He's introduced in 1:1, and of course, Mordecai's position before him is the final word that is given to us in 10:3. Ahasuerus is the one character that is seen throughout the book. We might say this is the book of Esther starring as Ahasuerus. And he's basically, from the beginning to the end in most of the major scenes within the book. Well, you read through once and see, well, what is the author saying about Ahasuerus? Well, he's very proud. He's very self-centered. Certainly, throughout the book, you realize, to use a present terminology, it is all about him. From bringing his princes and officers together for this great banquet, all the way through to the fact that he continues to reign with Mordecai at his side, second in command. Ahasuerus is there from beginning to end, self-centered and impressionable. In fact, that's what we see throughout the book. He's always acting on suggestions of those around him. Hey, Vashti won't come to the banquet. What am I supposed to do? Well, you got to let this happen. You got to issue a decree saying that every woman is to obey her husband within Persia. Yeah, you're right. Go ahead, issue the decree. Well, that means Vashti has to go because she didn't. Oh, well, what am I supposed to do now? Well, why don't you have a contest? Why don't you see who the most beautiful lady is in the land and make her your queen? Well, that's a good idea, good idea, good idea. Haman, signet, take my signet, do whatever you want. Same thing he'll do in chapter 8 of Mordecai. Take my signet ring, do whatever you want. Do you realize the signet ring was the symbol of authority? Signet ring is what, presses the wax to the edict that says this comes from the king. And here's the king saying, hey, take my ring, do whatever you want. Self-centered, impressionable, weak, easily manipulated. That's Ahasuerus. And with a king like this, Haman, vindictive, manipulative, crafty, proud. What we see with Haman is, all right, here is the king, and now Haman is the one who has the skill, if we can use it that way, the manipulation, to use his position of authority and his power over the king to put into effect his dastardly plan to wipe out the Jewish people. Mordecai, and as we've seen from beginning to end, from the time he's introduced to the very end, the author makes it clear Mordecai's great driving passion was his dedication to the welfare of the Jewish people. And because of that, Mordecai comes into conflict with Haman, whose driving passion was to destroy the Jewish people. So the conflict within the book is between Haman and Mordecai. And Haman and Mordecai in their conflict are seeking to sway the king. And the means for that conflict and for Ahasuerus to be swayed is where Esther comes into the picture. And what is Esther? Well, she is introduced to us as a beautiful woman, 2:7. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and of good appearance. And gentlemen, it means what it says. She was a physical knockout. And obviously God gives her beauty for what purpose? What is Ahasuerus looking for? A brainy woman? Ahasuerus is looking for what? The most beautiful woman in the land. And Esther's introduced to us as, Miss Persian Empire of, about 483 BC. She's the most beautiful gal in the whole empire. And the author is led by the Spirit to say that. She's beautiful. By the end of chapter 4, chapter 5, courageous. She is willing to say probably the statement she is known for. You know, best at the end of verse 16 of chapter 4, if I perish, I perish. All right, fast, we'll do the same. I will go unto the king, it's not according to the law. He can slice me right in two. He can put out the sword, and I'm history. But if I'm history, I'm history. That's the Essex paraphrase, if I perish, I perish. All right. All right, what is my life? If this dastardly deed goes through, I'm a dead woman anyway. So I go before the king, and that's exactly what she does. And in 5:2, she obtains favor in his sight as the king extends the scepter to her. But she's also prudent. Hey, you can have anything to half my kingdom. Well, I'm glad you said that, as you hear us. There's been a few things I've been looking for. No, all right. What's she going to do? This is almost, you know, Solomonic in the sense that, all right, you can have anything you want. What do you want? Why don't you come over to dinner? You and Haman. Well, all right. That's easy. All right, so she's prudent. I guess, yeah, you know, she brings Haman as well, and Haman starts to think, oh, Esther really likes me. Well, it's getting ready for the second banquet where he is going to be uncovered as the vindicative planner, plotter against the destruction of Esther and her people. So she's very prudent. She is and comes across, if I might put it this way, by the end of chapter 7, a beauty with a brain. A beauty with a brain who is willing to encourage the courageous act, stand up for the welfare of her people. Now, what is the book all about? We're going to come back. This is the major interpretive issue of the book. Why no mention of God? And why no mention of these main characters' spirituality? That is Mordecai and Esther. Well, because the author is showing that the Jews at this point are not explicitly invoking or remembering the ways of God. Yet nevertheless, though they have forgotten God, God has not forgotten them. So while the physical seed of Abraham was not faithful to Yahweh, they, the physical seed, were still protected by God from Gentile attack. And God is not mentioned because God really is behind the scenes, because the Jews have placed him behind the scenes. But he is still behind the scenes. And he is still at work, because behind the book of Esther is the Abrahamic covenant, which is what? The one who disdains you will be cursed, and the one who blesses you will be blessed. What does Haman do? He disdains the physical seed of Abraham. And because he disdains, what comes upon him? The curse. Indicative that even during this time where the Jews are outside of the land and under Gentile authority, God has not forgotten the Abrahamic covenant. By the way, that is the application of Esther to today as well. The Jewish people, the Jewish race today, except for that remnant that's come to faith in Christ, are where? They are unfaithful to Yahweh. They do not have a living, vital relationship with him. But God has not forgotten them. Why does Israel still endure through all of the attacks that seeks to destroy them, because God has not forgotten the Abrahamic covenants. And so Esther is about then, but it has an application even till now. And so it's a story that happened in history, but it engenders a principle that has continued to work till this present day. Everyone who has sought to destroy the Jews, where are they today? Destroyed. The one who disdained is under the curse. God continues to remember the Abrahamic covenant. By the way, that should be a great encouragement to the God who today is remembering the Abrahamic covenant, is going to remember the Abrahamic covenant and bring it to fulfillment in the future. He hasn't forgotten. Even some Christian covenantalists might have forgotten. But God still remembers the promise that he has made to Abraham. And we see that working out in the book of Esther.